Hello friends, welcome back to the Florida Road Trip Mystery Knit Along. This is Valerie here with another stitch tutorial. This one for leg 4 and specifically my clue, which is these holes representing the 7-mile bridge. I've got it here in dark yarn, and then I have it over here in a lighter yarn. I'm going to show you how to knit these wonderful little holes. Okay, in times like this, I always like to take a look at the chart. I know some of you prefer written directions, and there are good written directions in the pattern, but the chart kind of gives us a visual for what we're going to do. So there are a couple of special things we're going to do. We are actually going to be binding off some stitches here on row 7. And then when we come back on row 8, we're going to be using an E-wrap cast on, and we're going to pick up 3 stitches even though we bound off 7. And I know that may seem a little odd, but we needed to do that to give the holes the height they have. If you pick up the same number of stitches as you bound off, you're going to have something more like a buttonhole, which is very flat. I have this funny little symbol here, and this is a lift and purl 2 together. And I'm going to show you exactly what that means. It's just a way that I found that tightens up the end of that hole when we're closing the gap, that I think is really nice. Some other funkiness here. We've got these little upside down U's that have the number 1 in them. These are where we're going to add some additional stitches and also give some texture to the top edge of our hole. So let me get my swatch and we will get started. So I do have the swatch here, and I have done the first 6 rows. And you can see I have the row of purl bumps here. Let me zoom in a little bit more. And I am going to start binding off. So I find binding off to be both easy and confusing at the same time. The easy part is leapfrogging the stitch. The confusing part is knowing where to start. So in the pattern, I've got here, these are edge markers, but in the pattern, you'll also be using markers to mark the repeats. And I do have these markers set exactly where the repeats will be. So you're going to knit 2 stitches after the marker. And then it gives you the instruction to bind off 7. And there are some specific instructions about how to do that in the pattern, so please be sure to take a look at them. The first thing you're going to do is knit another stitch, and you're going to place a locking stitch marker in this. I know that sounds weird. This is going to come in really handy for you on the next row. So I wouldn't normally place a stitch marker in when I'm binding off, but this is, trust me, you're going to want it there. Okay, so I'm placing that first stitch marker, and now I'm going to knit another stitch. And now comes the binding off part. I'm actually going to push the stitch marker to the back, and I'm going to use the left needle to lift that second stitch, second from the tip of the needle. It's actually the first one that I knit, right? Up and over the other stitch and off the end of the needle. So now I have my 2 original stitches. I have a little gap, and then I've got 1 stitch. And then way back here, we've got that stitch marker through the stitch. And we're just going to keep him there, but kind of push him out of the way. I didn't lock him. I didn't have any issues with this earlier, but I'm going to lock him now just for the sake of safety. Okay. So I'm going to bind off another stitch. So again, I'm going to knit 1, and I'm going to leapfrog the further stitch from the tip to the closest to the tip, up and over. Here's bind off number 3. And I'm going to keep doing this until I have bound off 7 stitches. How will you know if you've bound off 7 stitches? Well, you can count as you go. Surprisingly, I found it difficult to count to 7 when I was doing the pattern. So one of the things you can do is bind off until you have 1 stitch left before the marker. And then I am going to knit 1 more stitch. So when we're done with that repeat, we have our stitch marker, 2 stitches, a gap where there happens to be a locking stitch marker, and then 2 more stitches, and then a regular stitch marker. Okay, and then you'll have several of these repeats, 7 to be precise, along the way. Okay, we're back, and as you can see, I have done my seed stitch, and I've actually purled the first 2 stitches of the repeat, and this has brought me to the place where I'm going to use an E-wrap cast on to cast on 3 stitches. Remember, we bound off 7 on the previous row, and we're only going to cast on 3. There are a couple of different ways to do an E-wrap cast on. I have one specific way written out in the pattern, but you can do whatever's most comfortable for you. What I have written in the pattern is you have the yarn dangling down in front because you've been purling, right? And you just slip your thumb underneath the yarn, and now bring the yarn back, the thumb back over, and you see how it kind of makes that X right there? You want to stick the needle in there at the X and then tighten up that loop. Now we have 3 E-wraps. Now you are going to find out what that stitch marker is all about. To tighten up this end of our hole, we are going to take the tip of the left-hand needle and slip it in where we have the stitch marker. And you can go either way, it's not going to matter. And I'm going to, once I slip the tip of my needle in there, I'm going to get rid of the stitch marker. And now I'm just going to purl that stitch that I picked up with this next stitch. So it's like a purl 2 together, just like that. And then purl the last stitch of the repeat. And if you look there, now we have the first 2 stitches that were purls. We have our 3 E-wrap cast on, and then we have our lift and purl 2 together, followed by a regular purl, and that's the end of our repeat. Okay, I've done my seed stitch, and here we are at the beginning of the repeat. So the first thing we're going to do is knit 1 stitch, and then we're going to make 1 left, and we do that by putting the tip of our left-hand needle under this bar between the stitches and lifting it up. And we go under the bar from the front. And now we are going to knit into the back loop of that so that that just kind of twists that and doesn't leave a big hole. And now we're going to knit, and now we have to knit into our E-wrap. And I find this to be a little challenging just because the yarn naturally pulls tight. So I tend to use my fingers. Sometimes I work the tip of my needle in there to get it a little bit loose and slack. And then I use my index finger to kind of keep that looseness there so that I can knit in to that, because it's really just a twisted loop of yarn. It doesn't have a lot of substance to the stitch to lock it in place like normal stitches do. So again, I'm just using my index finger and I'm giving myself some slack, and you can see how that loosens up so that I can get the tip of my needle in there to knit a stitch. And we've got 1 more. It helps to keep your needles real close together so that you have slack there. Insert the tip of your needle into that loop and knit. Okay, and then I'm going to knit 1 stitch, and now I'm going to make 1 right. And to make one right, I'm still going to use the tip of my left-hand needle, and I'm still going to go under the bar between the stitches, but this time I'm going to swoop in from behind and lift that up. And I like to use the tip of my right needle to give me some slack here. And now I'm just going to knit into the front and knit one more stitch. We're not fully up to our full complement of stitches yet, but we're closer, right? Because we just increased by 2. On the reverse row, this is just a simple purl across. So I will be back with you when it's time to start the next right side row. Okay, so I did my seed stitch edge. And now I'm going to work across as follows. First thing I'm going to do in these first 2 stitches is slip, slip, knit. And I know the question is, why did we increase 2 rows ago if we're just going to decrease in the same spot? And the answer is, I didn't want us to be too short of stitches and have the shawl draw in. So we increased, but now I want to put more of the stitches back in with the hole. So that's what we're doing. All right, so we did the slip, slip, knit. And now I'm going to knit 1. And now comes the fun. Those upside down U's in the chart that I showed you are instructing us to knit into the hole. Okay, the big old hole we've made. So you just insert your needle into the hole and wrap the yarn around it and bring up a loop. And then we're going to knit the next stitch and do it again. Into the hole, knit the next stitch, into the hole, bring up that loop of yarn, knit the next stitch, into the hole. All right, and then knit 1 more. And now on this side, we're not going to slip, slip, knit. We're going to knit 2 together to do that decrease. And if we look now, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 stitches, which is the number of stitches we started with all those rows ago. I am going to do my seed stitch, and then I'll be back one last time to show you how it looks. On this reverse side of the row, on the back side here, we're just going to knit so that we get a set of purl bumps here. Okay, so I'll show you that here in just a second. Okay, I've done my seed stitch, and now I'm just knitting back across the repeat. I wanted to show you that these loops that we pulled up when we were knitting into the hole are a little bit loose, but that's okay. So as you come to them, you just knit them like a regular stitch. And it will be just fine when we get to the other side. I'm going to purl one just to lock in that stitch marker and turn this around. There it is. So you can see there are loops that kind of go down into the hole and they smooth out that edge a little bit. And I think just give it a really nice texture. And I hope you enjoy making the holes here for the bridge, and happy knitting.